Hi, folks. Welcome back. It's been a minute. New place, new setup. Anyway, all that being said, the world is still the same. We're still seeing the same Democrat dysfunction we've gotten used to, still the same kind of lunacy playing out day to day right before our eyes. The war in Iran is still going on, even though it feels like we've been told multiple times it was supposed to end yesterday. No, actually, yesterday. No, actually, the day before yesterday. Well, it's still going on, folks. And needless to say, woke ideology still fighting on as well. We're going to look at all of that today, starting with this clip straight out of Canada that honestly feels like an SNL parody.
We will not let fear win. A world without trans people has never existed. A world without drag has never existed, and it never will. Queer people have always been here amongst us. They are our coworkers. They are our brothers, our sisters. They are our mothers, our fathers. They are our families. Drag is art. Drag is culture. Drag is educational. Drag is creative. Drag is comedy, but drag is not a crime. My name is Scarlett Bobo, and thank you so much for your time.
It's actually formidable when you consider it, how quickly the left can totally rewrite history in order to craft their arguments. And the fact that nobody really questions any of this is truly something to think about, because nobody does, especially in this sort of scenario. There isn't even the possibility to question it. They hand the bully pulpit to anybody, even a man in a wig, and expect everyone to accept what's being said as truth, not pure delusion. That's literally what we're witnessing here. And you can see it play out in real time. The people in the background, even the women behind the speaker, they're cringing, they're grimacing. They have enough common sense to recognize something is off, even if they won't say it out loud. Now listen carefully to what's being said, by the way, by this individual. They say, a world without trans people has never existed. A world without drag has never existed. That's not actually an argument. That's a rhetorical sleight of hand when you look at it. It's an attempt to take something that historically existed on the margins, often in very specific and limited contexts, and pretending it has always held the same cultural prominence, legitimacy, and moral acceptance that activists are now demanding. That's the rewrite. Yes, fringe behaviors have always existed throughout human history. That doesn't mean they were universally affirmed, normalized, or elevated, especially not in front of children. And let's be clear about something else here now that that's brought up. Nobody is saying that drag is a crime. That's just a pure straw man. Drag has historically been an underground form of lewd, crude humor. It existed in adult spaces, clubs, late night venues, places explicitly separated from children and family life. It was never meant to be mainstream, and it certainly was never meant to be something performed for kids in libraries or public institutions. That's where the line is. That's the actual issue people are concerned about. And this isn't even strictly a right-wing position, by the way. A lot of people on the left are uncomfortable with this too, even if they're too afraid to say it publicly. The concern is simple. Why is this being pushed into children's spaces? Why is there such an insistence on cross-sectioning this into some sort of child entertainment? Because I don't think there's a single reasonable adult, left, right, or otherwise, who genuinely thinks that a man in provocative women's clothing, often sexualized in nature, performing for children is appropriate in any way, shape, or form. That's the boundary people are reacting to. That's the actual issue at hand. And yet, what do we hear from this individual? Drag is art. Drag is culture. Drag is education. That's where the conversation just gets pure slippery slope. Because yes, technically, anything can be labeled as art. That word has been stretched so far, it almost means nothing at this point. Personally, I don't consider drag to be art, though I recognize others will likely disagree with that. But if we're going to call something art, it should carry meaning. It should transcend the senses. It should communicate something deeper, something enduring, something that speaks to the human condition beyond immediate gratification. And what we're seeing here doesn't do any of that. None of this is transcendent. It's sensory. It's performative. It's about aesthetics, attention, and in many cases, just pure provocation. There's no spiritual dimension to any of this. And that matters because historically, the highest forms of art have always pointed beyond themselves, toward truth, toward beauty, toward something eternal. This doesn't. It just satisfies impulses, not the soul in the least bit. And this is the broader moment that we're capturing here in this press conference. This labeling of Canada as the gay capital, the endless expansion of acronyms, the cultural pressure to affirm without question, it's all part of a larger trend from the left that attempts to not just tolerate, but to redefine reality itself, and to do so in a way that removes any ability to assent without being labeled as some sort of dangerous person. But culture doesn't work like that forever. There are always limits. And historically, when societies push too far in one direction, when they abandon grounding principles, whether moral, cultural, or spiritual, there's always a correction. Just look at Caligula. Just look at the Weimar Republic. There's always a recentering. And I do think we're heading toward that moment. Because look, at the end of the day, people aren't asking for much. They're not asking to ban adults from doing what they want to do in adult spaces. They're asking for boundaries. They're asking for common sense. They're asking for children to be left out of these sorts of things and for common sense governance that doesn't put this kind of stuff at the center. And they're also asking for the freedom to say, you know what? I just don't accept this. This isn't okay for me. I don't want it. Without being shouted down, silenced, or labeled as hateful. And that's really what this comes down to. Not fear, not hate, but reality, boundaries, and the basic question of what kind of culture we actually want to build moving forward in this country, or if we want to see just widespread decay. Because we've seen the decay. It doesn't get any better than this, folks. Just keeps going down that line. Now, we know what happens if we reject the decay. It goes the opposite way. And to be honest with you, the opposite way has always looked a whole lot better than whatever the hell this is. Now, as we all know, this kind of stuff doesn't just grow out of nowhere. There's a cause and an effect. And it's been apparent for the last few years that one of the main causes for the sort of cultural decay are the positions taken by white liberal women who seem dedicated to the full implosion and destruction of this country.
Boys, we all know, I think, or increasingly are realizing that boys are moving away from sort of the more progressive boys that spend time online are moving a little bit I'm trying not to be political here, but are moving to the right and being sort of influenced by the Andrew Tates and some of that sort of alt-right socialization online that we know is very, very dangerous.
Dangerous.
My husband and I were alarmed when our kids were watching sports online and my son knew about Andrew Tate and thought he was pretty cool and thought that his Republican grandfather, who's not a Trumper, but a fiscal conservative, thought that my father would like Andrew Tate. So that's scary. We're like one of the most progressive households, and our son is confused and asking all these questions. We're working on legislation to hold tech companies accountable and help them be a force for good in our kids and families' lives, to really provide all the best in class resources and support for youth so that they don't go down this rabbit hole of very, very dangerous and limiting narratives around ultimately what it means to be a girl and what it means to be a boy. We owe it to them and ourselves to kind of heal this this gift of modern technology, but curb it to be a force for good. I mean, look, the Gavin and I, we have 3 more years. We're trying to institutionalize our values,
of course,
so that they carry on beyond our term.
Now, I don't want to jump too far ahead and start making prophetic claims that Jennifer Siebel Newsom, who we just watched here, will be the downfall of Gavin Newsom's campaign. I do believe this kind of rhetoric has no place in politics in 2026, 2027, or 28. But I could be wrong. There may be enough fools who fall in line with this crap and still elect people like this in office. There's a reason the founders distrusted pure democracy, because they believed it could devolve into mob rule. They understood that with just a little charisma, you can convince people to throw out basic truths. Now, luckily, Jennifer lacks charisma, but she certainly doesn't lack wokeness, because this has to be one of the worst monologues I've ever heard in a long time. I mean, listen to what she's actually saying here. She's describing how she actively rewrites reality for her children, giving boys dolls not just to teach responsibility, but to blur distinctions. Rewriting books in real time, changing he to she to normalize something that isn't organically present in the text. This isn't education, by the way. This is just pure ideological brainwashing. It's not about expanding perspective. It's about controlling it. And then she caps it off by celebrating the destruction of gender roles as if the entire structure of human society is just some outdated narrative that needs to be dismantled. But here's where it gets even more revealing. In the broader conversation, she expresses concern that boys who spend time online are drifting to the right, and she calls that dangerous. Think about that, folks. Young men searching for structure, identity, discipline, and meaning, purpose, And that's framed as a threat. So what's the response? Regulation, censorship, institutionalizing our values. That's what she says. That's the phrase. That's the tell. This isn't about open discourse for these people. It's about shaping outcomes. It's about controlling how you raise your children. And let's be honest about what she's really confessing here. Whether she realizes this or not, she's describing a household where masculinity has been so thoroughly diluted, so carefully managed and softened, that her sons are inevitably looking elsewhere to find it. That's not speculation. That's the admission here. That's human nature, by the way, coming from these boys. If you suppress something fundamental, it doesn't just disappear. It reemerges somewhere else, often in a more extreme form. That's why figures like Andrew Tate gain so much traction. And look, people can debate the merits or flaws of someone like Tate all day long. That's not the point. The point is why young men are seeking him out in the first place. It's not random. It's not accidental. It's a response to a vacuum created by mothers like Jennifer Siebel Newsom. When there's no strong male presence in the home, when fathers are passive, when they're unwilling or unable to assert leadership, often because they don't want conflict, young men go looking for that structure elsewhere. And yes, let's just say it plainly, this is in many ways the downstream effect of modern feminism pushing women into roles that displace men rather than complement them. You end up with households where the father is sidelined, where authority is fragmented, and where boys grow up without a clear model of masculinity, so they go seek it somewhere else, in this case online. They find voices to speak directly that offer clarity, even if imperfectly, and they latch onto that, understandably so. You even saw this dynamic play out publicly. Gavin Newsom himself admitted in a conversation with Charlie Kirk that his own sons admired Kirk, that they were watching Kirk. Why? Because they're not getting that structure at home from Newsom. If there were strength, clarity, and masculinity present in the household, they wouldn't need to seek it externally. And this is where the political implications become completely unavoidable, because when you hear language like, we have 3 more years, we're trying to institutionalize our values from Jennifer Newsom, you're not just talking about parenting anymore. You're talking about governance. You're talking about using the power of the state to enforce your ideology that, by its own admission, struggles to sustain itself organically, especially among your own children, your own young men. You've been commissioned by God to raise and guide. That's the real indictment here, by the way. It's not just about one speech or one worldview. It's about a broader inability to understand human nature from the Newsoms. If within your own home, the structure is so weak that your children have to seek basic identity and purpose elsewhere, how are you going to provide that for a nation, Newsoms? Because leadership at the national level requires moral clarity, fortitude, and a coherent understanding of reality. And if those things are missing at the most fundamental level, that being the family, then scaling that model up to the entire nation doesn't fix the problem. It actually amplifies it. And we already have a proof of concept for how that works in the case of the Newsoms. I mean, just look at my home state of California.
I've given our boys dolls. Even if they tear the head off, I've given them dolls to learn that care and caregiving is not just an activity that's reserved for women, but that it's also an activity that is a responsibility of men. What I've done with both my daughters and my sons is, if I'm reading a book and the protagonist is a male, I just change the he to a she. And it just normalizes for my sons in particular. I don't even just do it for my girls. I do it for my sons because I want them to see that women can be the center of a story.
Oh, yeah.
That women matter. That women are interesting. At the end of the day, we're all kind of like in this place in history maybe where we're recognizing what it is to ultimately deconstruct all these gender roles and ultimately be human. And that's exciting to me. So, I'll just continue to kind of do my work and try and deconstruct all of these like limiting narratives about ultimately what it means to be human.
And you wonder why your kids hate you, Jennifer? Really? You wonder why your kids are gravitating toward figures like Andrew Tate when you're essentially rewriting them out of their own existence? You're handing boys dolls, rewriting books in real time, changing he to she, and then acting surprised when they feel confused, frustrated, and start looking elsewhere for clarity. What makes you think a young man naturally wants to play with dolls? Men and women think differently, and that's not controversial to say. That's just reality. Men are generally wired towards structure, systems, building, things like Legos, mechanics, problem solving. Women tend to be more relational and emotionally attuned. And there's nothing wrong with stating that fact. That's not conditioning. That's just sheer biology, psychology, and yes, even theology. We've been designed differently because we fulfill different roles. Ignoring that, trying to override it, reshape it, or pretend it doesn't exist doesn't liberate people. It creates confusion, resentment, and identity instability. And honestly, what Jennifer is describing here sounds like a soft form of ideological grooming. She's openly admitting that she's trying to reshape how her children see reality because she doesn't like the natural conclusions they're coming to. There's almost a sense of frustration behind it as well. Like, I couldn't raise them into what I wanted, so I'm going to subtly push them there anyway. You see this broader cultural pattern play out in Hollywood elites as well. Celebrities like Megan Fox or Charlize Theron raising their male children in these highly gender-confused roles, right? They're dressing their young boys as girls. And this isn't isolated. This is part of a whole trend here in California. A movement that's driven by a fear that Jennifer herself reveals here, that boys are going online and moving to the right, that they're being influenced by voices she doesn't approve of. So what's the response? Regulation, holding tech companies accountable, institutionalizing our values, as we saw that she just said. That's not parenting. That's social engineering. That's an attempt to control the inputs because you can't control the outcomes. Now, if we go even deeper beyond that, because this actually ties into something broader about how men and women process the world, especially when it comes to judgment, fairness, and decision-making. There was a 2006 neuroscience study published in Nature where participants watched fair players and unfair players receive mild electric shocks while the brain activity was scanned. Both men and women showed strong empathy when a fair player experienced pain. But here's where it diverged. Men's empathy dropped sharply when the person receiving pain was an unfair player, ergo a cheater. In fact, men's brains showed activation in reward centers, suggesting a sense of satisfaction, schadenfreude at justice being served at the expense of that cheater. Now, women, on the other hand, maintained consistent empathy regardless of whether the person was fair or unfair. Now, what does that tell you? What's the problem that study is revealing? It shows that men are more likely to integrate moral judgment into their emotional responses. They're more capable of making cold, calculated distinctions between right and wrong, fairness and unfairness. Women, generally speaking, according to the study, maintain emotional consistency, even when it may conflict with objective judgment. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean cruelty is good on the side of men. It's not. Schadenfreude shouldn't be celebrated. Justice should always be measured, rational, and accountable. But when you strip out the capacity for hard judgment, when everything becomes empathy first, emotion first, you start to see the downstream consequences, and we have started seeing those around the country. That's how you end up with systems that repeatedly release violent offenders, people with records as long as CVS receipts, back into society over and over and over again. And then when something tragic happens, instead of addressing the actual systemic failure, the narrative shifts to something like racial injustice or some other abstraction that avoids accountability. That's not compassion, that's just pure dysfunction. And that's the ultimate scenario that played out in the Irina Zarutska case, which is why this ties into leadership. If you look at trends in law, for example, since around 2016, more women have been graduating law school than men. You also saw under Joe Biden a push to appoint large numbers of female judges. Now, again, this isn't about saying women are incapable. It's about recognizing differences. If leadership structures become overwhelmingly tilted toward one mode of thinking, especially one that prioritizes emotional consistency over actual moral differentiation and analytical application of the law, you're going to see that reflected in policy outcomes and in the breakouts of violence throughout society. And this is where the theological framework also comes in. There's a reason Scripture establishes order, Christ as a head of man and man as a head of woman, according to St. Paul. This isn't meant to be oppression, but structure as responsibility. This is a reflection of different strengths and roles. When that order is inverted or erased, it doesn't create equality, it creates chaos. Isaiah 3:12 even warns this, "For my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. Those who guide you lead you astray." Now, that's not meant to be an attack. Have to couch it, because women will lose it when they hear that. But It's a warning. This is clearly a warning about disorder in leadership and its consequences. So obviously, when you hear someone like Jennifer Siebel Newsom talking about deconstructing gender, rewriting narratives, and institutionalizing values, you have to understand what's really being proposed. This isn't about parenting style. It's about redefining human nature, reshaping society from the ground up, and using political power to enforce that vision. And the irony is, her own example exposes the flaw. If her household is as progressive as she claims, and yet her son is still seeking out masculine voices elsewhere, that tells you everything you need to know. You can suppress reality, you can try to rewrite it, but eventually it pushes back. And when it does, oh wow.
I mean, I had to be very raw when we interviewed the young men who were juvenile offenders in San Quentin. I told them about my own loss, where I lost my older sister a few days before my 7th birthday, and I blamed myself for her death. And I share that because that they ultimately were accused of committing these violent crimes and sentenced for life. And I think it shocked them that this, blonde lady who was, interviewing them had a similar story, was perhaps in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right.
But wasn't punished the way they were, because clearly it was an accident, but theirs was probably an accident too. So anyway, I share that just because I guess, I quite enjoy spending time with people and being real and unmasking and showing them that it's safe to unmask themselves.
Beautiful, beautiful.
This is bizarre to watch because she's trying to paint herself as some kind of empathetic figure, but she's obviously operating almost entirely from emotion. And look, what she went through as a child is tragic. Losing a sibling in an accident at 6 years old is devastating. No one is minimizing that. But what's bizarre, what's deeply confusing actually, is how she takes that experience and then tries to map it onto hardened criminals serving life sentences at San Quentin. She's conflating two completely different realities. On one hand, you have a 6-year-old child involved in a tragic accident, no intent, no capacity for moral culpability in the same way an adult has. On the other hand, you have adult men, many of whom are in San Quentin for some of the most serious crimes imaginable in her community. We're talking about murderers, repeat violent offenders, people who were tried, judged, and convicted by a jury of their peers. These are not just abstract cases. These are real, adjudicated crimes with evidence, testimony, and legal due process behind them. Years of all of that. And yet, Jennifer Siebel Newsom says, theirs was probably an accident too. Probably? That's not empathy. That's just pure projection. That's taking your personal experience and forcibly injecting it into situations where it simply doesn't apply. It's flattening reality to the point where intent, responsibility, and moral agency no longer matter. Everything becomes the same. Everything becomes an accident. So think about how absurd that actually is. By that logic, you're placing yourself, a 6-year-old child in a tragic accident, on the same moral plane as a grown adult who committed a violent act. That doesn't elevate compassion, by the way. It just erases accountability. It ignores the very foundation of justice, which is the ability to distinguish between intention, negligence, and malice. And this is where you start to see the broader ideological pattern with figures on the left like her. This is what happens when you adopt a worldview that prioritizes emotional identification over objective reality. It becomes less about what actually happened and more about how we can feel about what happened. The details just stop mattering in this sense. The distinctions collapse. Everyone becomes a victim of circumstance, regardless of what they actually did. And in these cases, they did some pretty heinous stuff, but society can't function like that, okay? Let's be real. Justice systems exist precisely because we do differentiate. We differentiate between accidents and intentional acts, between children and adults, between negligence and premeditation. Without those distinctions, you don't have justice. You just have anarchy. And there's yet another layer here that's really hard to ignore. This same mindset, the one that extends unlimited empathy outward, even to those who have committed severe harm in our community, is often paired with a lack of grounding when it comes to responsibilities closer to home. As we just saw, she has zero empathy for her children. To her, they must be neutered of their own identity. They must be punished for seeking it out somewhere else. They must have that completely extricated from their lives. And this is truly a strange inversion where there's endless compassion for criminals, but confusion or even hostility toward the natural development of strength, discipline, and structure, especially in young men in your own home. And she admitted to this in the 2 clips that we saw earlier. So you end up with this really contradictory worldview that struggles to cultivate strength and clarity in the next generation while simultaneously extending blanket empathy to individuals who have demonstrated the consequences of a lack of both. And then to reconcile that tension, you just blur the lines. You pretend like it's all the same. You say, well, maybe they didn't really mean it. Well, maybe it was just an accident. But that's not compassion. That's just weakness. It's denial. Because real empathy doesn't require you to abandon the truth. You can acknowledge someone's humanity, their background, their struggles without pretending that their actions didn't happen or didn't matter. In fact, real compassion is grounded in reality. You recognize their suffering and responsibility. So what she's describing here is none of that. It's something else entirely. It's an emotional framework that, when scaled up into policy or influence, starts to erode the very systems that protect people in the first place. And that's the broader implication here. This isn't just a personal story that she's telling. It's a window into how decisions get made, how narratives are formed, and how dangerous it can be when emotion replaces discernment. And this is what the Democrats are trying to place in the White House. Just think about that, folks.
My new film, The Great American Lie, argues that inequality and the systemic causes of inequality dating back to our country's founding are a result of an imbalance of our values, an exaltation of rugged individualism combined with a deprioritization, some might even argue stigmatization, of partnership in the collective.
She's a commie. That's really what this is. And it's interesting when you actually slow down and listen to that kind of language, because it's not really meant to communicate anything clearly. It's what I'd call commie word salad. And it shows up a lot, especially with Democrat figures. You look at Jennifer Siebel Newsom, you look at Kamala Harris, you look at AOC, they all participate in the same style of speaking. It's vague, it's filled with buzzwords, and it's designed to sound profound without actually saying anything concrete. And that's the key point. Nobody's really listening. That's how these women get away with it. Because if you actually break down what she just said, inequality, systemic causes, imbalance of values, rugged individualism, collective partnership. It's a string of ideological phrases stitched together with no real definition, no specifics, no measurable claims. She said absolutely nothing in 20 seconds, which is honestly pretty impressive. Now, obviously, part of the reason why she's able to get away with this is because she's a woman. Because compare that, what she just said, to someone like Hassan Piker. You might completely disagree with him. I do, on mostly everything, but at least he's actually saying something. It's bad and it's wrong, but it's coherent. There's an argument there. By contrast, what you're getting here with these commie word salads from these Democrat women is absolutely nothing. And this style of rhetoric works because expectations are lower. There's no demand for precision, no demand for clarity. Just repeat the right buzzwords and people assume depth. Rugged individualism bad, collective good. Okay, well, define those terms. What policies are you proposing? What outcomes are you measuring? How do you distinguish between healthy individual responsibility and destructive isolation? None of that is ever addressed. Instead, what you get is this moral framing where America's founding itself is subtly blamed for inequality because of this supposed overemphasis on individualism. That's the underlying claim of Jennifer Siebel Newsom's statement here, because here's the problem. Rugged individualism is not some flaw in the system. It's the foundation of personal responsibility, innovation, and upward mobility. And it's what allows people to build, create, and take risks. Strip that away, and what you're left with isn't partnership. It's just sheer dependency on the state. And that's the broader implication of this kind of thinking. When you hear phrases like deprioritization of the collective, what's really being suggested is that the individual should be subordinated to some undefined group interest. But who defines that interest? The government? Cultural elites? People making films like Jennifer's? That's where it starts to drift into something much more ideological and much more dangerous. Because look, history has shown time and time again that when you elevate the collective above the individual without clear boundaries, you don't get harmony. You get control. You get systems where dissent is framed as selfishness, where personal success is viewed with suspicion, and where the role of the individual is to conform rather than to think independently. And again, none of that is explicitly stated. It's just implied. That's how this rhetoric works. It's not about clarity, it's about conditioning. It's about shaping how people feel about certain concepts without ever fully defining them. So when Jennifer Newsom says this and people nod along like it's profound, ironically, what you're really witnessing is the power of language used not to explain reality, but to actually obscure it. And if you actually demand specifics, if you actually press for meaning, you realize very quickly there's just nothing there.
Like every problem that we have in society right now will be fixed when women come together and partner with our male allies and other allies. But when more women are in the rooms, making decisions, changing the status quo, and transforming not just our culture, but our society and our economy. I'll give you one example. Look at Silicon Valley. Had more women been early on in those companies or at the tables of power making decisions, I don't think we would have so much or have allowed for so much sort of bigotry, racism, misogyny, and hate online. I don't think that we would have the anonymity of it. I think that there would have been ooh, that's unkind. That's not okay. You can't make money off of that, about dividing people, misinforming people.
What do you think you're doing here?
Belittling people, bullying people. I mean, again, think about who's the victims online more often than not. It's women, LGBTQ+, marginalized communities, women of color.
I need someone to do a study and tell me if her hand is just caught in a permanent peck, because she always looks like she's about to peck your face off with those fingers. But look, all jokes aside, this is actually very revealing, because what she's saying here very plainly is that every problem in society would be fixed if more women were in charge. That if women had been running Silicon Valley from the beginning, there would be less racism, less hate, less misinformation, less toxicity online. And look, that sounds nice on paper when she's saying it. Actually, it doesn't. It sounds compassionate. Actually, it doesn't. But when you actually think about it, for more than 5 seconds, it completely collapses under its own assumptions. And by the way, there have been women in Silicon Valley. And also, why hasn't there been a fully women-run company that's been as popular as Instagram? They have the ability to go out and build one. Why not do it? I want to see it happen. See, the problem here is that Jennifer Newsom seems to have no real understanding of male psychology, or honestly, just human psychology in general. The idea that you can build something like the internet, one of the most chaotic, decentralized open systems in human history, and that it would thrive under constant early guardrails, constant emotional moderation, constant, that's not nice, don't do that. That's just not how people behave. That's not how actual innovation works. Innovation requires risk. And removing all risk as something as needing risk in order to be able to thrive and grow, it's kind of like kneecapping a hitter right after a bunt and hoping he makes it to first base. Now, what she's actually describing is essentially turning the internet into a middle school classroom run by the most overbearing teacher imaginable. And here's the problem with that. Nobody would have joined if from day one you had someone standing over your shoulder saying, don't say that, that's unkind. Don't post that, that might offend someone. Don't engage like that. People would have simply opted out. The platforms wouldn't scale, the communities wouldn't form, the entire ecosystem would collapse before it even began. And ironically, what Jennifer Newsom is advocating for here is the same kind of surveillance mindset she seems to apply to her own household. This idea that if you just monitor, guide, and restrict enough, you can engineer better outcomes. But that doesn't create healthier systems. It creates artificial ones, and people reject artificial systems. Her own household is a great example of this. Her own children are looking outside of her engineered household for strong male figures, because clearly they don't have that in their own home. Now, look, that's not to say the internet doesn't have problems. Of course it does. There's misinformation, there's toxicity, there are genuinely bad actors. That's real. But that's also reality. Human beings are flawed. When you create a space where millions, eventually billions of people can communicate freely, you're going to get the full spectrum of human behavior, good and bad. The solution to that isn't to pretend you can sanitize human nature out of existence. It's to build resilience, to create better tools for accountability, and to allow discourse, even messy, uncomfortable discourse, to happen. Because spaces where ideas are exchanged are not supposed to feel perfectly safe. They're supposed to be open. So this is where her argument reveals its deeper implication, because this isn't really even about safety. This is about control. Because when she says we wouldn't have allowed anonymity or we wouldn't allow people to profit off the vision, what she's really saying is that she believes someone, presumably people like her, should have the authority to decide what speech is acceptable, what ideas are permissible, and what conversations should be allowed to exist. Who should be allowed to make money off of this stuff? That's not a cultural adjustment. That's centralized control over expression. Again, it's commies saying the quiet part out loud. And here's the irony. The same people who advocate for this kind of control often frame themselves as protectors of marginalized voices, but historically, the ability to speak freely, even anonymously, has been one of the most powerful tools for those very groups. Remove that, and you don't just remove hate, you remove dissent, you remove whistleblowing, you remove unpopular truths from servicing. So what you're left with isn't a kinder internet, it's a narrower one, a more controlled one, a more curated version of reality that aligns with whoever is in charge of defining what's kind and what's acceptable. And look, stepping back, the broader claim that simply putting more women in power would fix societal problems, that's all just unrealistic. It's reductionist. It assumes that complex issues like human conflict, bias, and disagreement can be solved by swapping out one demographic for another. That's not how reality works, much less governance. Societies function best when there's a balance of perspectives, when there's different strengths, different ways of thinking, and yes, different temperaments are all part of the decision-making process, not when one group is elevated as inherently more virtuous or more capable of solving everything. Because the moment you start believing that one group, any group, is a solution to all problems, you stop thinking critically. And when that happens, you're not building a better system. You're just replacing one form of imbalance with another.
Really, with First Partner, I wanted to continue the work that we have been doing at the Representation Project, which is basically deconstructing stereotypes, in particular gender stereotypes. And I felt like lady was sort of a backwards connotation of who we really are as wives, as partners, as spouses.
What? Nobody cares. That's it, point blank. Literally nobody cares. Nobody cares that you chose to rename yourself something different. You just sound ridiculous when you start saying stuff like this. Leftists, primarily women, have to understand that they sound ridiculous when they start saying stuff like this. Anybody going around saying, I'm not a wife, I'm a partner, I'm this, I'm that. No, you're just overcomplicating something that's already clear to everybody. That's what you're telling everybody. You're offended by the word lady. You can't even use the word lady. That's not profound. That's you telling on yourself. Because this is what's really going on here. Jennifer Newsom is trying to dress up something very simple in this kind of ideological language about deconstructing stereotypes, but all that really means is stripping words of their meaning because you don't like what they represent. Lady has always carried a connotation of dignity, responsibility, femininity, and a certain standard. And instead of rising to that, the move is to just say the word itself is the problem. And look, let's be real. There's a reason why she has a problem with the word lady. This is someone who had well-known associations with Harvey Weinstein early in her career. And that context matters when you start hearing someone reject the word. The idea of being labeled a lady, it's not that the word is outdated, it's that the standard behind it is uncomfortable for somebody like Jennifer Newsom. That's the reality. She's not rejecting a word. She's rejecting the expectation tied behind it because she knows she's not a lady. That's why she has to rebrand it to First Partner. Not because it clarifies anything, but because it distances her from something that she is admittedly not. She thus gets to adopt something more neutral, more ideological, more in line with this broader push to erase distinctions altogether and make herself sound virtuous as she becomes partner, because lady is offensive. That's a bigger issue here. This isn't even about a word anymore. It's about a mindset that thinks changing language changes reality. It doesn't. You can rename the role all you want, Jennifer, but the role itself doesn't disappear. You're still the first lady. And the more you try to deconstruct everything without replacing it with something coherent, the more you end up making yourself look like a fool and showing all of us that perhaps the rumors between you and Weinstein are true. Anyway, shifting gears to the war in Iran. Since my last video on this topic, there has been a ceasefire. The 10-point plan suggested by the Iranian government has drawn a lot of criticism, along with a lot of speculation and questions around Trump's motivations, why we got into this war, and why we're leaving it in the manner in which we are. It's been very split, to say the least, and it's getting a lot of negative traction on both sides of the aisle. I have my own take on this situation, and I'll be making an in-depth video covering all of this in the coming days. But as for now, as we enter the second day of the so-called ceasefire, let's take a look at how things are playing out in the Middle East right now.
You can see here on Wednesday in Beirut large explosions in the southern part of the Lebanese capital. The IDF says they were targeting Hezbollah, but we know that dozens of civilians were killed in these strikes. One survivor describes what it was like in the streets of Beirut.
We are living in a nightmare. So I'm afraid today to sleep. So maybe it will happen this the second time. Who's gonna? I don't know. What? I will pray and then sleep. That's it.
Getting Israel to stop bombing any country in the Middle East is like getting a neutered dog to stop humping other dogs. It's just not happening. They seem incapable of it. And honestly, I'm surprised the ceasefire has lasted as many days as it has. I'm grateful that finally Lebanon is getting some attention, because with the Iran war dominating headlines, a lot of what's been happening in southern Lebanon hasn't been fully recognized by the media. I've personally been seeing reports for a few weeks now throughout this Iran conflict that Israel has been bombing southern Lebanon in a similar fashion to how they bombed Gaza, hitting primarily civilian areas under the justification of, we're just targeting Hezbollah. And look, that claim is being repeated constantly, but a lot of people are calling it into question. When you hear reports that dozens of civilians were killed in a single strike, you have to ask, what exactly is the strategy here? Because at a certain point, it stops looking like targeted operations and starts looking like broad destructive force. And this is exactly why I don't want the United States involved in any of this. Israel's posture towards its neighbors, militarily, economically, strategically, it's aggressive across the board. There's this constant pressure to dominate, to weaken surrounding countries, to assert control through force. And yes, I understand this conflict has been going on for decades, generations at this point, but at some point, enough is enough. You're not going to bomb your way to peace. You're not going to stabilize the region by leveling it. And America needs to step back. We need to stop funding this. We need to stop sending weapons, sending money, sending resources that ultimately contribute to this cycle of violence. Violence that, let's be honest, involves civilians, involves children. Need I remind you, within the first days of this broader conflict in Iran, there were reports of a school being hit by one of our Tomahawks. That alone should have been a wake-up call to every American. I don't think any rational American believes this is in our national interest. And if you look at polling, support is eroding on both sides of the aisle for Israel. People are tired of endless involvement in Middle Eastern conflicts that don't serve American citizens, and we all recognize that it's mostly because of the Israeli lobby pushing American politicians to support these sorts of foreign policies, as well as the entanglement between our military-industrial complex and Israeli intelligence. And look, to be clear, you always have to add this disclaimer because of how dishonest people are nowadays. This is not about the Israeli people. This is about the Israeli government. This is about U.S. tax dollars being used to support policies and military actions that many Americans fundamentally disagree with. It's about sending weapons overseas while Americans are at home struggling. And yes, there are serious questions being raised about leadership decisions, about how much latitude Trump gave Netanyahu, about the influence of people like Jared Kushner and his cabinet, and whether that's resulted in what feels like a blank check for continued escalation in the region by Israel. That's unacceptable. It's not something that we should be funding. It's not something we should be supporting. If Israel wants to pursue this war, that's their decision. But they should also bear the consequences for that decision. The United States does not need to get dragged into another prolonged conflict in the Middle East. There's no reason why Americans should be dying in that region right now. Now, I do hope the ceasefire holds, at least on our side, but we'll have to wait and see, I guess. I'll be putting together a more in-depth video in the coming days, breaking down all of this further and getting into the broader implications in this conflict. But all that being said, folks, thank you so much for watching. Tell me what you think about this new space that I'm in. I'm still building it out, obviously. Take care. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. Peace.